Good morning. I'm Oriana Rosa Royal, Management Today's Senior Reporter, and thank you for tuning into today's session on British unicorns. There'll be time at the end of the session to answer any questions you may have, so send them as and when you have them. But first, let me introduce you to the man in the hot seat, Forterro CEO Dean Forbes. He's one of the UK's most successful tech CEOs for turning around firms and orchestrating billion-dollar exit deals. Thank you for joining us today, Dean. How are you?
Good. I'm good. Good morning. Good to be here. Thank you.
That's great. So 2022 is set to see a record number of US buyouts of UK listed companies. I think that shows that the UK ground is a breeding ground for entrepreneurs, but perhaps has its limits when it comes to scaling up. I mean, what do you think it shows and why do you think that is?
It's good to see the UK kind of tech scene coming back to life. For a long time, we were kind of out of the game for a minute, but it's good to see the tech scene coming back to life. It's good to see the public markets coming back to life. And I think kind of COVID has helped a lot of entrepreneurs double down on, their business and their strategy, and has made us all rethink what we're doing. So I think it shows a good resurgence in, British business and startups in particular.
And why do you think we're seeing so many US buyouts? Do we have limits when it comes to maybe funding and investment?
No, I don't think the capital markets have ever been as active as they are now, right across Europe, right? So access to funding, access to liquidity has never been better, in the 20 years I've been in the space than it is now. So I don't think it's a funding or a liquidity problem. I actually think it's the kind of classic US expansion question. I think that's kind of number one, right? Which is, US companies have a great advantage over European ones. They operate in almost a single jurisdiction. They operate with a single currency. They operate largely with kind of federal restraints, although there are some kind of local variations. So they're able to scale with a lot fewer barriers than their European counterparts. And then they reach a point in the US market where, the next value creation element often comes from geographic expansion. And then they have to ask themselves the question, do we try and do this organically in Europe and try and master all of these different languages, currencies, HR policies and legislation? Or do we buy a business that's already scaled and already has a head start in Europe? And more often than not, for US scaled assets, the answer is buying out a European business to gain that footprint almost in one hit.
It's really interesting. Do you think for British companies and European companies, I guess, that they risk becoming a bit homogenous when they are bought out by these kind of US global firms?
It depends. I think you've got two different dynamics. You've got the dynamic at scale where you're talking about, very well scaled US operations buying very well scaled European operations. And I think in that sense, there's, a lower likelihood that the European organization gets dragged towards the US business. When the assets have kind of lower scale, that can happen because the smaller European asset doesn't have the track record of operating at scale, probably doesn't have the revenue and or EBITDA. And you have the US asset, which is, thinking that what we've done here really works. This is our blueprint. This has driven great results for us here. So we ought to try and, implement those on the acquired European asset. And I think that's where you can have some of the dynamics that you just mentioned. But my observation is US companies looking to do those buyouts have become much more educated in the last decade or so that, if you're buying a European company that's mastered a handful of European geographies, you should work hard not to kind of disrupt that.
And if a founder or CEO is finding there's a bit of disruption, is there any way of retaining that kind of culture or British identity that is loved by their consumers?
Yeah, I think the number one thing in my experience is to spend time on that at point of transaction, right? It's harder to get into that debate once the deal is done and once you have a new owner who has a underwriting case for doing that deal. It's harder to have that discussion then. It's much easier to have the discussion on the way into the transaction. Are we aligned? Do we have the same expectations for this business? Do we think about the way to drive success in Europe in the same way? And to what degree can you get assurances? How can you write that into the deal? How can you protect that going into the transaction? It's much easier to do it then. And I think that's actually important to do as you come into a transaction, to feel out the culture of your acquirer and make sure to the degree you can that you are aligned.
And you're kind of speaking from experience. You've just gone through this with Forterro, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I joined Forterro when I first became involved in the company in late 2019, early 2020, talking to the owners then about their exit aspirations. And we set about, a 2-year program to drive growth and ultimately, get the company to that unicorn status and then find a new owner for it. And I would say one part, 3 parts of that journey was, one part was the strategy and making sure we had a solid, high growth, value accretive business. The other part was the long-term plan for Forterro. And then the third part was making sure that the new owner and us as operators and managers were aligned for the reasons, we just kind of touched on. And we were very fortunate. We got our €1 billion valuation in February this year.
Congratulations. I mean, do you have any advice for founders on making that transition to a new leadership team, things that they can set up in advance or things that they should be looking to do even when they've just founded the company, knowing that at some point they will need to find a successor or someone to take it to that new level?
I've got a classic Zoom noise problem. Sorry, one moment.
No, that's fine.
Right. I think that's one of the most important, elements in my experience. And, my career has been built on coming into businesses that have hit a point of scale, and investors and founders, have come to the conclusion that it needs now a new management team with a new ethos to get the business to the next inflection point. And I have a huge affinity for founders who had the courage to start something with their kind of own money, right, on the basis of an idea and passion that they had, and scale that, because that's simply something, I've never done and I don't think I could do. So I have a huge amount of respect and admiration for people that do that. But I do think it's important, and I've seen it go extremely well in the case of Forterro, where that was very well thought through. The management team that I took over from were part of that process. There were discussions about that over a good period of time. A lot of consideration went into the profile of next generation management team that would be needed, and when it would be right for that team to come into play. And it was just a very well thought through and orchestrated transition. And, whilst I'm very proud of the €1 billion valuation, and there was a lot of hard work that went into that, I think a lot of that was enabled by the way the transition was planned and managed before, these guys even ever spoke to me for the first time. So a lot of that, value jump, I really do think came from that. I've seen other situations where, founders and operators are perhaps finding it difficult to detach themselves from what's necessary for that next inflection point. And in almost all cases, there would have been a period before, change was enforced, that the founder had the opportunity to think about their blind spots, think about how to add people to the management team that would complement them, think about bringing into the business the skill set needed for the next phase. And for a variety of reasons, sometimes stubbornness, sometimes passion, sometimes just finding it difficult to self-reflect, those changes weren't made. And now we've hit a point where investors and shareholders are maybe being a bit more forceful about that change. So I think the number one piece of advice from the transactions I've been involved in is to be very, very proactive in that thought process, and to almost take yourself, the individual out of it, and think about it as a set of skills needed to go from point A to point B. And do we have those skills? And if we don't, how do we get them in? And then point B to point C. Are there another set of skills that we need now as we get to that next milestone? and don't be precious about whether or not you are the person that holds all of those skills, because it's almost impossible that you will. Get good people around you, and be thoughtful about that, and be proactive in thinking and planning for it.
I mean, I've never founded a business, clearly, but I imagine not being precious about, your baby, something that you created, your mind's probably quite hard. Is it impossible to, scale and become a unicorn without handing those reins over?
No, I think we've seen, a lot of good examples where that happens. Now, it happens in the minority of cases, right? More often than not, businesses with a €1 billion valuation today are not operated by the founding team. However, I think that's a generational shift, right? So if we take Forterro, founded in 2012, enterprise technology, B2B, very heavy core systems, that's the Forterro business. So we've grown fairly slowly over the last, 10 or 11 years. So in that case, very unlikely that the founding team, ride that business through the billion and then, to 10. In fact, it will probably be somebody else who takes it through 10, probably 10 billion, probably won't be me. That's one generation, but we have a new generation of unicorn now, which are the kind of more explosive unicorns, which are, founded, raise funds, go through hyper growth as they disrupt the market and achieve that unicorn status. In the case of somebody like Hopin, in kind of 18 months, right? From start to unicorn at 18 months, which is just absolutely incredible. And then typically those are more B2C type organizations. COVID has given birth to, I think I read, over 500 of those in the US. So that's a very different situation, because you're talking about a very, very narrow window. So you would expect the founding team to get through those first couple of inflection points.
As a person that does come in when, things are looking a little bit stale and turns it around, what is it that you look for when joining? How do you know that it's going to be a unicorn when you join? Do you have an exit deal in mind? What's the thought process?
Yeah, so I've been involved, or I've led kind of 4 exits now. So the first 3 combined were €1 billion, and the last one on its own was €1 billion. And I think in each case, it's different. In the first 3, which were smaller businesses, and all very different, although 2 things were true in each of them. The first was there were a handful of sacred cows, right? A handful of things which were very dear to the founders and operating teams, which had become, kind of toxic in the business, right? There were things that either weren't generating the income, or were sucking on the profits, or were harboring the strongest talent in the business. Instead of being vectors for growth and value creation, they were actually anchoring the business. And I think that comes back to what can sometimes happen, which is a bit of founder blindness as you go through this over a long period of time and become passionate about projects because you believe in them, and perhaps don't see the wood for the trees. So that was true in the first 3. And the other thing that was true is very, very good, experienced management teams, but again, not enough skills around the table for what was needed to be successful in the next phase of the journey. And I'm not advocating that as you go through these journeys, you transition out management teams in their entireties. But I do think it's important, if you want to do the next thing, that there are some people on the team who have done it and seen it and can bring that experience. So that was 2 things which were true in each of the 3 businesses. And to answer your question, those were the 3 things I tackled, and addressed first. And in some cases, the things that were being held dear could become successful, but changes were needed. And in other cases, the things that were being held dear just needed to be stopped. Right? We needed to, move on and get the business back to its core. But those 3 were quite different from Forterro, because as I described, a lot more thought was given to, how we get to that billion and preparing the company to get to 4 billion, which is where we expect it to be in the next 3 to 4 years.
And you mentioned like toxic behaviors. Are there red flags you look for where you're like, instantly, this will never become a unicorn?
I mean, unicorn status or hyper valuations come back to kind of product market fit, right? So your service offering or product market fit and opportunity in that market, either existing or one that you're creating with your product market fit. If you look at one of the darlings of the UK unicorn scene, something like Gymshark, where the world was awash with fitness apparel. None of us needed another brand of fitness apparel, but they carved a niche for themselves with fitness influencers, built that business with extremely low costs, really leveraged kind of social media marketing, and suddenly this thing is taking off. So I think first is product market fit and or service offering fit, and then it's the team to execute that initiative. Because I think we've all seen, and probably a lot of people on the call have seen, great business ideas or wonderful solutions to problems, but then the team, fall over when it comes to relentlessly executing on that proposition. So I think if I go into a situation and I can see a pathway with both of those things, I've got great product, I think there's a need, I think we can carve a need, and I think I have or can get a team together that can execute on this better than it has been before, then I think high valuations are possible. In the case at KDS, where I was unable to do that for the first 3 years of the journey, we didn't achieve we achieved a great outcome, but not the one we could have done had we got to that a bit sooner.
I've got one more question for you, and then I believe we're opening up for questions to the floor. So if you're watching, do send any questions for Dean. So you briefly said that you might not be the person to take Forterro to 10 billion. So what's next then for you now that you've been acquired? Obviously, the hard work does not stop there.
Yeah, this journey was quite exciting because for 2 years, as I mentioned, we kind of refreshed the company in the 3 categories that I mentioned, and I'm super excited about driving this business to its next point, which is hopefully a 4 billion euro valuation. We're the largest supplier of ERP technology to mid-market manufacturing companies in Europe. That's a space that I want to see us dominate even more. We just completed an acquisition on Friday, fairly big acquisition for us, which we'll be announcing soon and then integrating into the business. So I'm hyper excited about the journey from here to 4 billion. But then I think it will be my job shortly before we get to that point to work with shareholders about what we need to get the company from 4 to 10. And I think together we'll have to decide, A, if I have the right skills, and B, if I have the right energy at that point, because I've been doing this a long time now, if I have the right energy to go from 4 to 10. And if not, it'd be beholden on me to kind of get out of the way and help find the next person who can drive to that next point. So really excited for the next 3 to 4 years, but then we'll see what's on the plan after that.
I mean, do you have any advice for having that kind of level of self-awareness to know, do you know what, it's time for me to step aside and let someone else, take it to the next level?
First of all, I have an advantage. So if the business was my business, I think I'd behave differently, right? I think if I had remortgaged my house a few times, if I had, been there the days when it was difficult to make payroll, and I had managed it through those difficult moments, I think I would be more precious about, handing it over to somebody else. This is why I say I really do understand it. And as a result, kind of my motivations are different. My motivations are to get to the next planned and desired point. I think for people who are running their own businesses and have founded their own businesses, I always ask them to think about, lifestyle and legacy, right? What is it you want to be remembered for and left behind? And does the current situation give you the best chance of achieving those things? I've spoken to founders who say, I want to leave behind a great business that has created a lot of jobs and has done a lot of good and has given me and my family a good lifestyle. And I see other founders who say, I really want to maximize this exit, right? I really want to make a lot of money from this. And both are fine, but just being really clear on which of those two things and or others, I think helps force people into the thought process of, well, if I want this to be a €1 billion business, am I truly the best person to do that? And it sometimes causes a different thought process. So clarity on, what's the legacy? What do you want to be remembered for? What do you want to create and leave behind? And then the tough questions, are you really the best person? And if you are, great. If you're not, get help.
And how early should founders be thinking about that? Should it be like as early as when they get an investment, or should it be when they're already a few years in the running?
So now on boards, I encourage people to think about this in 5-year increments, because that's a good technology life cycle, right? So 5-year increments. So perhaps not thinking, in 25 years time, what do I want to do? Just in 5 years time, I'm at, we just raised at 500 million. Now we'd like to be at $1 billion in 5 years. And then at the 4-year point, I think it's a good time to say, right, will we get the $1 billion? Yes. And if we do, what's next for us? 4 billion. Okay. Am I now the person to do that? Yes or no? I think 5-year increments is a good way to kind of think about it and reflect.
5-year goal setting, quite. And one of our viewers wants to know, so many of the unicorns are in the fintech industry. Is there perhaps something that other industries are missing? Maybe there's a hack they don't know about?
Yeah, I think in tech and in startup land, and I don't know if this is factual, but it's just my assertion, right? That a lot of startups explode as intermediaries, especially in the B2C space, right? They have a good idea of how to put themselves at the intersection of a lot of traffic. So travel is a good example of that, a sector that I've been in. Retail is another example of that, and fintech is another example of that. Now, the benefit of fintech is it's other people's money, right, flowing across the platform. And the UK has an outsized reputation as a good banking center in kind of global economics. So I'm not surprised that we see so many of our startups in fintech, but I would bet money that the majority of high value, high growth tech unicorns are in one of those three spaces. Because as an intermediary, you have very low costs. You take advantage of traffic that exists because of other people's products and services. And if you can kind of master that, there's a lot of money to be made. Somebody like Zilch, another great UK startup, buy now, pay later, driven by an app and a MasterCard white label service. Incredible, allowing people to do their shopping online, buy clothes online, pay 25% today, and then essentially have a credit agreement to carry on paying for a dress or a pair of shoes. They don't have a product or service other than putting themselves in the intersection of transactions that are already happening.
Another viewer wants to know, how can startups keep their culture in that transition to a new leader?
Well, first of all, do you have to? Right? Do you have to keep the culture? And I've had that conversation a lot as well about
really
preserving the culture. Why do we want to preserve this culture? And why do we think about it almost always in its entirety of the culture? Why do we say the culture we have today, we want to take all of this into the next chapter? Because it's impossible in my mind that the culture that made this company successful at 100 people will be the culture that makes it successful at 1,000 people. In my opinion, it's impossible. So the better question for me is, which elements of the culture need to be preserved and why, and which elements of the culture need to be proactively dropped, right? So, two very quick examples of that. At Forterro, when I joined, we branded the previous generation as what we call Forterro 2.0, and we branded the next generation of Forterro as Forterro 3.0. And the number one reason we did that is to be able to talk to our 1,400 employees about which things were so important and powerful in 2.0 that we're no longer going to do because they were right for 2.0, and which things were really good and important and valuable in 2.0 that we do want to take to 3.0. And it created a clear line of culture that was good. We're happy for it. We recognize it, but we're leaving there. and culture and behaviors that were good that we do want to take into the new generation. So I think it's impossible to take culture through generations in its entirety. And I would say, be thoughtful about which elements of the culture are good and will survive actually in the new generation as well. The Friday afternoon, we all eat pizza and drink beer at 4:00. It's hard to do at 2,000 people, right? It's really easy to do at 150 people. It's hard to do at 2,000 people in 50 locations across Europe with different legislation about beer in the office. I mean, so some things just, die through generations, I'm afraid.
I really like that, actually. It's not often that, it's questioned actually how important is that startup culture, is a different company ultimately once it's scaled, right?
It has to be, right? Has to be.
And do you have any advice for communicating those changes that you had to your 2.0 and 3.0 employees? Was there any uproar?
Yeah, of course there was. Of course, uproar. There were questions, there were resistance. Not all employees felt great about that. We've got a very high percentage of employees with 10 years plus tenure, right? So we've got a very long-serving employee community. So change is quite difficult for them because they've known one environment for a long time. But like with all changes, over communication is the place to begin. And as we all know in management, we hit a period of time where if people aren't embracing the new way things will be done, then we have difficult conversations with those folks about how can we get them on the bus, and if we can't, then the bus has to keep on moving without them. But over communication is the only way I've been able to do that. And as I said, the framework of that generation's culture was these things, but this generation's culture is now these things, and being really clear about that has been helpful. Has been helpful for me.
Amazing. And we've got literally 1 minute left. So let's leave our viewers with, what's your final piece of advice on creating a $1 billion company?
Do not think about becoming a €1 billion company. is my advice. Think about the customer community you want to serve, why you will be indispensable to that customer community, more indispensable to that customer community than anybody else doing what you do, and what the next inflection point is, because the next inflection point may not be a €1 billion valuation. So I wouldn't obsess on that. If the next inflection point is 800, press hard for 800. And when you get to 800, reflect again. That's how we did it. That worked for me.
Don't obsess on 1 billion.
No, let that be a consequence of a great product, an excellent company that is standing out in its space, and then the €1 billion will come.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dean. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you for everyone watching. I'll be back shortly with our next speaker.
Thanks, guys.